Mr. Ambassador, I understand that you are a long-time admirer of Winston Churchill, and I would love to hear, what does Winston Churchill mean to you? What aspects of his long career do you find most appealing?
Yeah, so there are many, but I think in this job or in previous jobs, and you've been in these positions as well, Ambassador, it's his resoluteness, it's his resolve, and yeah, I just think of the hero speech in 1941, where he basically says to the students, if you can and distill the lessons learned from that prior year into one statement, and never give in, never give in, never, and nothing great or small, large or petty. Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, just in our daily life, but also for those of us that are in public service and have to face some of the challenges that may not be as great as Sir Winston faced, but nevertheless can be daunting.
Well, I think you anticipated my next question, which was, what lessons do you think that people in your position and other world leaders can derive from his example, from his writings over the years?
Yeah, so he had such it's a great question. It's a tough question though too, isn't it? Because he had such a long and varied career and life. From his early years to even his later years. There are examples and lessons you can learn from each one of those. I think of I wrote an article a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, during the last administration when we were in the midst of defense sequestration, and we're kind of our lead from behind and strategic patience approach to the world, and the Ukraine had been invaded by Russia, and it had kind of a 1930s feel to the moment. And so the things that I focused on, I wrote in this article, and again, you always go to his speeches, right? After the onslaughts, when he had a merry little band of 4 or 5 parliamentarians that were supporting him, and he came into the parliament and he said, a country like ours, and this resonated with us today as Americans, a country like ours, possessed of immense territory and wealth, whose defense has been neglected, cannot avoid war by a continuous display of pacific qualities or ignoring the fate of victims of aggression elsewhere. And so that seemed appropriate a few years back. He went on to say in the same speech, if mortal catastrophe should overtake the British nation and British Empire, historians of 1,000 years hence will still be baffled by the mystery of our affairs and never understand how a victorious nation could have allowed this to happen. And you looked at the wealth and the power and the prestige of the United States of America, and you wonder how we allowed the rise of a very aggressive Marxist-Leninist China, and how we abetted in that rise. And I think historians are going to look back and see us and say, what were policymakers thinking? And we can talk a little bit more about that later. After the Sudetenland Munich Accords, he said to the people of Great Britain, and remember, appeasement was quite popular at the time. I mean, Chamberlain came back to acclaim. Now we look back, and Chamberlain's a dirty word, and appeasement is a dirty word, but appeasement was quite popular when the Munich Accords were signed. And I was thinking similarly with the JCPOA and the deal with the devil that we made with Iran, and I thought this applies. The words he said in Parliament, and it was very unpopular for stating them. He said they should know, talking about the people, that there's been a gross neglect and deficiency in our defenses. They should know that we have sustained a defeat without war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along the road. And then he went on to say, do not suppose this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning, and talked about the supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor. I think some of that has occurred in the United States, but at the time, those were the speeches that were resonating. But as you go through different stages of your life, or you read my early life, you think of those fun swashbuckling days in Cuba and India and Afghanistan and Sudan and South Africa. Not all that was fun. It was serious business of war, but of a young, adventurous Churchill, that's an appealing time. And then as you get older, and as I look especially after a couple of years in these jobs, and you start thinking about retirement or getting some sleep, cruising around the bed on the Christina or going to Monte Carlo and or going to the track and watching the horses, which occupied that last decade. That kind of looks appealing as well. So I think it's, he just lived such a long and varied life that you can kind of take a look at different segments of his career, and depending on where you are and the circumstances of the country, you draw lessons from him.
Well, it's clear that you have a very, very strong grasp of history. And it really raises the question, and you've alluded to it, I think, how do policymakers use history? Which lessons do they select? It's often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. How do you view, looking beyond Winston Churchill and his experience, and what examples do you use in order to help you understand the very different challenges that we face today?
So that's another great question, and let me just give you two examples from things that happened today, and I appreciate. I think I'm a little late for the recording here, and I appreciate you having the courtesy of waiting for me, Ambassador. This morning we dealt with the Abraham Accords, and we had a really terrific announcement that Sudan, which was in a state of war with the state of Israel, entered into a peace treaty, or is entering into a peace treaty with Israel and normalizing diplomatic relations. And we had the Prime Minister Hamdouk of Sudan and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel and the President of the United States and a number of us were in the Oval for that call to formalize the agreement, and we'll get it signed in the next couple of weeks. And that's the third Arab. Well, thank you. It was a big day for the president and for Israel and for America as peace starts to break out. This is the third agreement that we've had in about a month of peace between Arab countries and Israel, which many people thought couldn't be done. We've called the Accords the Abraham Accords, and so to really get a grasp of what's happening in the Middle East, and there's a lot, and it's a very complex area, and I know you spend a lot of time as Director of Policy and Planning looking at those issues. And you even think of the name of the Accords, the Abraham Accords. You've got to know a little something about Isaac and Ishmael. You've got to know a little something about Jacob and Esau. You've got to know a little something more modern about Sykes-Picot or the Balfour Declaration. You've got to have some knowledge of what UN General Assembly Resolution 181, the partition resolution, is, and everything that's happened since then. And so it would be very difficult for us to be the mediator, for us to be the convening party that brings the parties together, to play our role if you didn't have some passing familiarity with the history. Now, that's a relatively extreme example of history that goes back to Genesis. But when you're in these meetings, as you know, with these leaders, they're making references and cultural references and religious references and bringing up things that they might be bringing up something that's 70 years old. They might be bringing up something that's 700 years old, and so I think it is useful to have a historical background. It doesn't mean you have to be a history major to be in government, but some of those common cultural things that used to be prevalent and we all tended to know growing up. I think we're losing a little of that, and that's something that worries me down the road. This afternoon, I spent some time with the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And again, that's a conflict rooted in history, some recent history, post-Soviet history, Soviet history, but then also going back to the early days of the conflict between Christianity and Islam and that kind of borderlands region of the Caucasus. And I can tell you references to each one of those stages of their history was brought up by both foreign ministers during our meeting. So I think it's useful to have a grasp of history. And I think a grasp of history also helps you with human nature. I mean, it would be hard to think of understanding just human nature when you're in meetings with foreign leaders or when you're thinking about military engagement. If you hadn't, read the Iliad or you haven't read the Aeneid and you haven't thought about some of those big questions and those issues that drive people and have driven us for, thousands of years. So no one had a better understanding, and I don't think any world leader had a better understanding of history and it's multifaceted, not just British history, but continental European history, world history, Asian history than Churchill did. So none of us are going to measure up to where the standard he set, but we can certainly strive for it.
Well, that was a very eloquent defense of liberal arts, actually, Mr. Ambassador, and having a broad gauge view of things, as Churchill did.
Since I've got no STEM background, so I can only say, it's like moving to the right for a jump shot. If that's the only shot you got to go with it.
Well, I think that it helped inform his leadership abilities, and as you know, the National Churchill Library and Center at George Washington has just recently been renamed to the National Churchill Leadership Center. And maybe you can share with us a little bit your thoughts on leadership and whether and how it can be taught to a new generation.
Oh, I think it was a great move to change the name of the center. And I think it's something Churchill would have appreciated and certainly approved of. I mean, look, there are these different thoughts, and as we become more modern and more progressive and more scientific, I think the idea of studying leadership, of studying great men and great women, has faded a little bit in popularity, and in some cases is even derided. And there's a focus on geography, whether it's Mackinder or Mahan or more recently Kaplan, or the idea that geography is destiny. And then you've got others who it's all about demography is destiny, the population size or ethnicities or movements of people, and that explains all of history. And then you got the idea that societal forces and changes make all the difference. And look, all of those things are important in studying history, but if you think about, one of the things that I try and do is, if I go out and exercise in the morning or take walks, it's hard to have as much time to read in this job as I'd like, but I'm trying to listen to Audible and listen to Andrew Roberts' Napoleon biography, which is really a magnificent book now. I just finished Cherno's Grant biography. But if you just go back in history, you can pick 100 of these lists, but if you thought sort of Alexander and Scipio Africanus and Caesar, and jumped ahead to more modern times to Washington, Napoleon, Lincoln, Grant, Churchill, Reagan, Thatcher, Dr. King, where would we be? A little farther, Elizabeth I. Where would we be as a nation or as a West or as people if you didn't have those great leaders? And so, I'm kind of at all of the above. I think certainly demography and geography and societal forces all play a huge role in shaping us and in shaping our history. But I also think that there's a place for great men and great women and for leaders. And so I think studying, and when you look at all of them, and you look at what happened in 1940, there's certainly a case to be made. I could make the case. You could make the case in a trial measure or back practicing law that Churchill could be is arguably the greatest or top 3 or 4 in relatively modern history of the past couple of millennia. And so to have a center devoted to the study of his leadership attributes and his qualities and the things that he did. I mean, you think of some of them. I mean, someone like my current boss, he didn't sleep very often. He'd be up till 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, and unless Smuts was there to call the party off early and let the staff officers go get some sleep before they had to go out to work in the morning. Now, he took his naps and he slept in a little later in the morning, but he had a tremendous amount of vigor, and he used as much time in the day as he could. I loved his actions this day. Clips, paper that he'd clip onto to his bundles, and we call that here Trump time with the president. We've got a very energetic president who wants to get things done immediately and doesn't kind of look at the world the way that some of the President Bush, who we worked for, or others that we've worked for in the past. He's anxious and impatient and wants to get things done in a way that Churchill wanted to. I think one of the things that Sir Winston did was the way that he wrote and communicated. Everyone knew what his views were, whether it was through his memos, and he had more secretaries than I've got, or probably even the president has, and rotate them through them all day with his dictation. But no one was confused about what his policies were and what he wanted done. And he did the same thing with his writings, and he did the same thing with his speeches. And so And he inspired people with the speeches. It wasn't just here's the plan or here's the policy. He inspired people. I mean, Ronald Reagan did that. I think of, one of the great speeches, the Point to Hook speech, which was Churchill-esque and in nature, the ability to inspire your followers. And so there are just so many lessons that you can take from Churchill's life that can be taught at the center and at the leadership center. I think it's a great. I think George Washington University is lucky to have the center there, and it's a great asset for the university for sure.
Well, thank you for that. One of the more memorable phrases that Churchill coined was a special relationship to describe the Anglo-American alliance during the Second World War. And over the years, I think it's fair to say that the special relationship has sort of waxed and waned. I believe that it still very much exists, but I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. What form does it now take? Is it as strong as ever? Is it changing? And what do you think the future of the special relationship holds for us?
So look, I think it's a critical relationship for both us and for the UK. Usually my first call, if there's a crisis or a major issue, would be to my counterpart, Mark Sedwell. And Mark, I think, is going to go off to, I'm sure they'll go off to the House of Lords and be Lord Sedwell here soon. But now I'll call Dom, Foreign Secretary Raab. That's usually the first call we make when we've got a major policy issue or there's something breaking. Is we'll check in with the UK and we'll get their view of how things are going and where we can we'll approach things jointly. I think with the UK leaving the EU, I think we're going to end up with a free trade agreement with the UK. I think that's going to further cement the special relationship. It's and I would expand it beyond just the UK-US relationship, really to what we call the Five Eyes relationship, which focuses on an intelligence sharing agreement. But when you factor in the Anglosphere, where the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it's an incredibly powerful group of countries that increases our ability to protect our way of life. It increases our overall population. It increases our defense capabilities. It increases our intelligence capabilities. It increases our economic capabilities. When we're confronting a rising China, we're confronting Russia. That doesn't mean that we don't have other great allies, but there is a special relationship and a kinship that we have with the UK. I think of post-World War II, maybe the best example is my friend John Lehman, and I know you know Secretary Lehman as well. In 1982, we didn't learn this for many years later. I think he didn't let folks know until 98. He and Cap Weinberger had gotten together and decided that if the UK in the Falklands War lost Hermé or Invincible, that we would supply the USS Iwo Jima, which was Harrier capable, to the UK, and we were actually had British liaison officers, and we would have leased the ship to the UK immediately and gotten it down to the Falklands to replace one of the carriers that had fallen. People don't realize that's the depth of the relationship, and although it was kept very quiet at the time, I think President Reagan, as Lehman recounts, told him when he explained the plan, give Maggie whatever she needs. And I think there's a real strong element that remains today. I was just out on the Queen Elizabeth last year, the aircraft carrier, when she made a visit to the U.S. She deployed 2 weeks ago for a naval exercise, and of the F-35 Bs, there were 10 U.S. Marine Corps F-35 Bs and 5 RAF F-35 Bs. So we had U.S. air power on a British carrier. One of the escort ships, there were a number of them. One of them was the USS Sullivan's, a destroyer, escorting the new UK strike group. So that interoperability and that relationship and much of the special relationship, goes back to the naval alliance between the countries. That's well predates the Second World War. I think that continues, and so I think it's the relationship between us and the UK is strong. We're going to have differences as we do, but we're mature countries and we can handle those differences, whether they're trade differences or differences on a specific policy. We can handle those in a mature fashion, and just because we disagree on one issue doesn't undermine the overall strength of the alliance.
And I think you'd agree the foundation of that special relationship is really a set of shared values that go back centuries. And you recently wrote an article, I think just a few days ago, that appeared in Foreign Affairs about China being a threat to those values. And the question really relates to Churchill, who presciently warned about the twin evils of fascism and communism and the threats that they pose to Western civilization. So I think I know the answer, but as you survey the global landscape, what threats do you see out there that might pose that same challenge for American democracy or Western values writ large?
Well, that's a question I'm asked a fair amount, I think, just because of the job, and I think the answer is twofold. I think the generational threat that we face, and thanks for plugging the foreign affairs piece. It's out in this month's foreign affairs, so you can get it online. It certainly is China. I mean, we face a very, very serious threat from the Communist Party of China and the People's Republic. It's a threat that we should have known earlier. We should have recognized earlier, but for 40 years, we've all had this consensus that as China became richer, as China became more industrial, as China became more modern, they would become more like us. And so we turned a blind eye to intellectual property theft. We turned a blind eye to human rights abuses, whether it was Tiananmen Square or Tibet or bullying of Taiwan, now basically the annexation of Hong Kong, or at least the ending of the Sino-British Declaration of 1984 and ending the democratic experiment in Hong Kong. We're seeing a very nasty little conflict that China started on the line of actual control in the Himalayas between China and India. You've got the assertiveness in the South China Sea, where China's basically annexed a huge swath of the Western Pacific with no legal basis whatsoever. We've turned a blind eye to all this because we thought, they're going to become more democratic. And we did that because we didn't read and we didn't listen to what the Chinese were saying. And the Chinese all along have been a Marxist-Leninist country. They're the heirs to Stalin. If you go into the PLA Army Museum, there's a big statue of Stalin as you walk in. Xi Jinping, I gave a speech about this. It was similar to the Foreign Affairs article. And the Chinese didn't really know how to respond to it for many months. They hammered Secretary Pompeo's speech. They hammered my deputy, Matt Pottinger's speech. They hammered Bill Barr's speech, Attorney General Barr's speech. They didn't know what to say about mine because I said, hey, these are Marxist-Leninists and here's what they believe. And they want to change our way of life. And the problem is that's what they do believe. And so if you criticized it, you might get in trouble for criticizing the party orthodoxy. But they knew it was a bad look for that message to get out overseas. So look, we've got to stand up to that threat. The more immediate threat that we have on a day-to-day basis comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the flip side of the coin of ISIS. And it's just in a state form and an extreme Shia form. Iran is propagating terror all over the world, but specifically in the Middle East with the relationships with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, the Houthis, the Kataib Hezbollah, and the other paramilitary groups in Iraq. It's a real challenge. They're building advanced weapons. The arms embargo just ended, and they're going to be attempting to buy even more advanced weapons. They're building ballistic missiles that could eventually reach the United States. They're spinning their centrifuges. So we've got a real problem with Iran. I think we're dealing with it by the maximum pressure campaign, and I think they're under tremendous economic pressure. That may drive them to the table. But that's a short-term threat that if the mullahs miscalculate and decide to attack a U.S. ship in the Strait of Hormuz or attack U.S. forces or allies to break what they see the stranglehold on their economy, that's the sort of thing that could end up with a more short-term conflagration. So those are the two things that on the bigger threat scale that we look at almost every day.
So I'm wondering if I can just follow up and sort of twin those two together. And so how concerned are you that the Chinese will actually continue to support the Islamic Republic of Iran in ways that we think will be detrimental to our security and to the security of our friends in the region and elsewhere?
Well, look, it's a concern. They're trying to put together a longer-term deal for a long-term petroleum purchase contract, so to speak. There's support, but the Iranians are pretty nationalistic. The Chinese are pretty nationalistic. They're both used to getting their way. I think the two of them negotiating together would be something to watch. I think there's also a geopolitical problem for the Chinese, and it's something that we've found, having been in the Middle East for many, many years. The Chinese biggest supplier of oil and gas is the UAE. The UAE is not a big fan of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So China's going to have to learn how to navigate. They can't just come in and take all sides in the Middle East the way that they do in some other regions. And so they're going to have to start thinking about, how do we pick our allies? How do we pick our trading partners? And I think China's going to have a tougher time than they think they may navigate in the Middle East. Just as we found, it hasn't been a picnic over the past, since the end of the Second World War.
So I want to change gears for a second and get back to Winston Churchill and his political career, during the course of which he made many powerful enemies. And yet, quite remarkably to somebody who's reading about it today, he was also very generous in separating his personal opponents, his professional opponents, from his personal friendships. He had ongoing social relationships with many of the people who he argued with in Parliament every day. And so today, looking back on that, that seems like a bygone era. Is it possible to take some of the vitriol, some of the demonization out of politics and still at least maintain personal, cordial relationships with people who politically feel differently than you do?
Yeah, I think we need to. This is the U.S., but I think there's some polarization in the U.K. as well. But especially here in the U.S. and in Washington, we're in a very polarized time. And I just compared in my lifetime, when it's not career is not a long span, but I came back to Washington as an 18-year-old intern the first time I came to work here, to work for the RNC during President Reagan's reelection. And the first call I got at the RNC was from a young Democrat congressman who represented us out in California, and I'd known him and knew his family, and called up and said, "Hey, you getting a place to eat dinner? Do they have a decent internship program there?" And I ended up every Friday night, meeting up with his interns, and his wife was a state court judge, and hanging out. It was very normal. People had relationships across the aisle. Congressmen and senators got along with each other. I remember the same congressman called and said, "Hey, if you don't want to work for a Democrat, I'll call my friend Olympia Snowe, who used to be a congresswoman from Maine, and said, yeah, you can go to work for her next summer if you'd like to." There was just a different environment, a different sense in Washington, and I think there was more socializing across the aisle than there is now. I think social media has had a very detrimental effect on how we communicate with each other. It's much more vitriolic. But I've also had some success here. I think of my prior job before I took this position. I was the president's special envoy for hostage affairs. And when there's American hostage abroad, you don't care, what party they are, what race or religion they are. It's just an American that we need to get home. And I had some very good relationships working with Democrat senators and Democrat members of Congress who were trying to get people home. Jean Shaheen worked very hard. The Democrat from New Hampshire, worked very hard to get Pastor Andrew Brunson home from Turkey. She also worked with me on a hostage, Amir Fakiri, who was a wrongful detainee who was in Lebanon. And so we developed some great relationships across the aisle with our Democrat friends. I had the misfortune, or maybe the good fortune, I got a little immunity from having COVID this summer, and I won't embarrass the person, but one of the most senior Democrats in the country was one of the first people to call to see how I was doing, to make sure I was all right. And I was very, very touched by that. It was a very humane, nice thing to do. And then I'm sure the person went out and gave me a hard time for not wearing a mask or something later on a Sunday show. But so I think I think there's a desire for people to have a little more civility in politics on both sides of the aisle, and I think that's something that we need to get back to. And I was encouraged by the debate last night between the president and the vice president. I thought it was quite a professional performance by both men, and I think Churchill's a good example that we can have disagreements without being disagreeable, and we can realize that we're Britons or Americans, even though we have different political parties, and enjoy our the camaraderie comradeship that we have as fellow citizens or fellow subjects.
And well, thank you. That's very encouraging, actually. And I want to touch on your reference to social media, because it seems as if it so often just inflames public opinion. People are outraged immediately, and then they understand belatedly. And so, maybe you could share with us, what do you try to do? What do you think Churchill could possibly have done in this environment to try to educate, to try to explain, to try to have people be a little bit more reasonable and understanding rather than just judging immediately?
Well, excuse me, I think he would have been a genius at Twitter. I would have loved to have seen the WSC on Twitter, because he would have worked for days and days and days to come up with that perfect 180 character spontaneous tweet that went out just at the right time. He would have had a number of those lined up and ready to go that he'd worked on and been prepared for. So I think he would have been terrific on Twitter. Look, one of the things he did, though, and I think we need to, I've tried to do this some, is use Twitter. I don't have a Facebook account, but we have a White House NSC Twitter account. Try to use that to be informative about what we're doing and what's happening without, and it's easier for me because I have a non-political job, and we're a Hatch Act. We're covered by the Hatch Act, and I'm a further restricted employee because of my national security duties. And so, we try not to be overtly political. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about the president's successes, and some may view that as being political, but we try and have a very informative Twitter feed. And, I think that's one way to address it. The other thing that we've done is I've tried to write 1 or 2 op-eds a month. Again, 600 to 800 words isn't enough to fully flesh out and explain a policy, even if one, especially if it's in a complex area. But it does give you more space to explain to the American people, to explain to the government, the folks that are implementing the president's policies, how the president sees a particular issue. And so I think we've had 18, 19, 20 op-eds. We had the foreign affairs piece that you mentioned earlier. I probably give 1 or 2 speeches a week, usually to think tanks, but I try and get out to universities and even shipyards and places around the country that should or are interested in hearing about the president's national security policies. And so I think I've probably given 50 or 60 speeches over the past year. And I think that's another way to get the message out that is a little more textured than you just get in 180 characters on Twitter. I think it's now 240, whatever the new number is for Twitter.
So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that. I'm sure back when you had more time on your hands that you probably visited the war rooms in London.
Yeah.
And in one of those rooms, you can actually see the room where Churchill met with his senior military advisors. And if you look very closely, you can notice the chair in which Churchill sat has a well-worn groove on the left arm that was formed by Churchill banging his hand on the chair and the wedding ring actually making an indentation in the chair itself. And I think it just gives one sort of small, visible, tangible indication of the enormous pressure that he was under as a leader at that particular moment in time. And I'm sure it's true for you in your current position. How do you manage the stress and the pressure of leadership at a time of enormous moment, of enormous responsibility?
Yeah, so fortunately we're not in a world war, which Sir Winston was at the time that he grooved that chair, and I love the cabinet war rooms. It's I remember every time I go to the UK I try and visit. It's a little tougher now because you've got the detail and a schedule, and it's hard just to spontaneously break away. But I remember taking one trip where I had I think a 5-hour layover at Heathrow, and I had just enough time to get in the cab and get to the cabinet war rooms, go through them, get in the cab, get back, and board my connecting flight. And it's an amazing place, and it gives you a real feel for what he was going through during those years. Like you just try and do your best. One thing I try and exercise in the morning if I can. I try and spend as much time with my wife and when they're in town, my daughters and family. I try and spend some time reading things that may not be directly related to the briefs that you're given every day, the stacks of paper you're given every day. And I think that's how you can manage the stress. The other thing is to try and just have some magnanimity in your relationships with other people that you're working around. I mean, everybody's got, everyone you're working with sitting around. We're in the Situation Room here, what we call the John F. Kennedy conference room and the Situation Room. And if I'm sitting here, I'll have Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper and Steve Mnuchin Wilbur Ross and the Chief of Staff Meadows and Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, and others, Attorney General Barr sitting around this table. Every one of them is under immense pressure and has equities from their department or agency that they're protecting, and everyone wants to get to the right decision. And I think if one way to lessen the stress is if you really come into these meetings and your interactions with your colleagues with a true belief that they're acting in good faith and they're not acting to undermine you or the president or a policy or that sort of thing, but we're trying to get to the right result. But folks have different points of views and different interests, and maybe validly so, maybe better than yours. If you can have that sort of attitude as you deal with your colleagues and try and build consensus and try and get the president the best advice and the best options you can, I think that relieves a little bit of the stress as well. So it's not quite the infighting that you might read about if you just read Political or Axios or some of the stories. We've got a pretty good team and pretty good relations here, and I think that's something that helps reduce the stress of the job, as well as by sharing it among colleagues who are highly capable. Gina Haspel is another one who'd fall into that category.
So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing some of your valuable time with the International Churchill Society, and thank you very much for your service.
Well, thanks. I read the newsletter as soon as it comes out every month, and I wish we could be there in person with with COVID. It's a little difficult to do these things recorded and by Zoom, but hopefully I'll get a chance to meet with you in person in the not too distant future. And Mitchell, thank you for all your past service to the country and for your friendship. So I appreciate the chance to be with you today.
Great. Thanks very much.